as we talk to Candy Leonard, author of the book Beatleness, who's been on the program before. She'll offer us some perspective on how fans were affected by that show and the Beatles' activities in 1965. Candy, the previous year, 1964, is generally considered the group's biggest year in terms of their popularity here in the States. But where 1964 saw them creating that first flush of success, in 1965, the group were basically sitting on top of the world.
Yeah, no, I think that Beatlemania certainly started in '64, no question about that. I mean, it's certainly in the U.S. We can look at the appearance on Ed Sullivan as sort of the, ground zero of Beatlemania, if you will. But it was building and building and building, and if you look at the newspaper accounts at the time, or even talk to people who were there at the time, the fans I interviewed for Beatleness, it was hard to believe that it could even get any bigger. Could people be more obsessed? Could young people be more giddy about the Beatles? But it kept building and building and building. And, of course, in the summer of '64, 6 months after Sullivan, you had A Hard Day's Night and the '64 tour, and then new music coming out all year, culminating in the release of Beatles '65, which was the must-have Christmas gift for baby boomers in Christmas of '64. It was called Beatles '65, but clearly, it was forward-looking. But then I think that I agree with you that '65, it was built. It was at a whole new frenzy, and not just young fans, but you started to see articles about their business interests. And of course, the fall of '65, they get their MBEs, and so yes, I think that a case can be made that Beatlemania was greater in '65. Absolutely, but that was their big year. I agree, more so than '64, because it just kept building and building and building.
The other thing to consider is that every bit of Beatle music that was heard in 1965 was new music. When you think about '64, one of the reasons why the Beatles had, let's say, the top 5 songs in the top 10, because we were listening in the States, we were listening to songs that were recorded 2 years earlier. Everything
That's
was
right.
released in one fell swoop. I mean, you had the Beatles going back to England and talking about how they had to play stuff like From Me to You in America because it was a hit, whereas in England they had dropped that from the set list because that was an old song. Of course, in the U.S., no one had any idea that Love Me Do and Please Please Me were older songs. Everything in '65 was brand new. It was real time.
Yes, that's true, and it was also more advanced and sophisticated than the music that we heard, before that was coming out in '64. I mean, by '65 we already heard them evolving, and I think that that's part of why it just kept building and building, because there was never any boredom, there was never any Beatle fatigue at that time, because it was just this new music just coming at us, and it was brilliant, and it was, as I said, more sophisticated than the stuff that came before. So we already heard them evolving, and they were still so fresh and so new. And as I say in the book, and as every time I talk about it, I'm struck anew at how true this is. And when I still talk to fans, is that there was nothing else going on in our young lives that was anywhere near as interesting, exciting, and engaging as the Beatles. And this remained true. I mean, by the time they performed at Shea, it was already 18 months, a year and a half after Sullivan. So this thing had been building for a year and a half. There was nothing else that excited us like this. And, we just, whatever they did, we were there. We were engaged with it.
We're talking with Candy Leonard, author of the book Beatleness, as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Beatles at Shea Stadium, 1965. Candy, the amazing thing about this concert, one of the biggest concerts ever, and the biggest rock concert up to that point in history, there was really no advertising.
They didn't need it.
Yeah, a couple of DJs on the radio mentioned it, but really just word of mouth was enough to fill that place.
No, they didn't need to promote it or advertise it. I mean, it was, the 55,000 people who were there still, I mean, you talk to people who were there, and they look back on it as one of the most significant events of their lives. And these are people who are now in their 50s and 60s, some even older than that. And they remember it as just, the event of their certainly of their young life. And many people will say it's the greatest thing that ever happened, that they were so lucky to be there and to be part of history. And they describe the absolute thrill of being there. I mean, as we were just talking, I mean, they were the biggest thing on the planet at this point. And so for you to be there in that, even though it was a huge space, it was, a 55,000 capacity baseball stadium, to be there, part of that scene, really seeing the show was in many ways the least of it. I mean, yes, seeing them was a big deal, but hearing the new people say, well, why is all the screaming? You couldn't hear the music. For many of the people there, that's not what it was about. It was about really making the scene, if you will, being there, being part of history, being connected, being in the same space that these four guys were occupying at that moment, made you feel so special and so ecstatic. And that was, why it remains to this day such an important memory for people who were there. And the description of the streets after the show, where people were let out into the street and people were talking about it, and they described it as it was electric. The energy was just like nothing anybody had ever seen before. And people became friends with the people who shared their binoculars or who, hitched a ride together, whatever. I mean, it was I'm not going to necessarily compare it to Woodstock, although one could, I suppose, as sort of significant gatherings. But it was a really special event for those who were there. And of course, it was the first time that rock music has been presented in a venue like that. And of course, now it's commonplace. But at the time, for 55,000 people to gather in one place to listen to music, it had never happened before. And of course, across the country at the same time, there were the Watts riots in Los Angeles. I remember as I was doing my research, I was looking at the front page of the New York Times and the front section of the paper, this juxtaposition of the Beatles at Shea and the ecstatic crowd, and then juxtaposed with the race riots in the Watts section of L.A. So it really, it's like a kind of a funny snapshot of America in 1965 and what was going on. And it was also, of course, the Voting Rights Act and, the Great Society programs, Medicaid, Medicare, the sort of the politics of the moment were all, there was obviously the civil rights movement was heating up and all this, but there was an optimism, even with, riots and this and that. There was an optimism in the country at that time. And I think that the Beatles performing, the Beatles touring, young people being so tuned into them and what they represented was really part of that optimism.
You mentioned the thrill those fans had in 1965 with occupying the same space as the Beatles. And you know what? That thrill continues in a different form right to this very day. Because when I've seen Paul McCartney in concert, and I'm a big fan of solo Paul McCartney, I'm happy to hear those songs and I want to go and have a good time. But I can't help but think to myself, I am only a few yards away from an actual Beatle. I am occupying the same... I mean, it sounds crazy. I sit there and I go, I'm an adult. I shouldn't be thinking this way. You just can't help it.
Yeah, I mean, they're larger than life, And so when you are in the space with them for that moment, you're near something amazing. Language fails to describe, what it was like. I mean, when I saw McCartney in 2002, which is the last time I saw him, I have to admit. But yeah, it was a huge thrill. I never got to see George live, but I've seen all three of the others live. And yeah, it's an absolute thrill. I was at the show at Madison Square Garden, the Elton John concert, when Lennon showed up. And yeah, that same feeling like, oh my God, I'm in this space with this person. And it does sound kind of silly, but these guys were so important to us, as I was saying, and occupy a place in our lives that really there are no words for. How do you describe that the role that the Beatles played in fans' lives and the importance that how they became sort of central to us, a focal point. So to actually get to see them is a thrill, to say the least.
Mr. Ed Sullivan.
We're back talking with Beatles author Candy Leonard about the 50th anniversary of the Beatles at Shea Stadium. We were mentioning seeing Paul and Ringo live now, and I'm sure that for a lot of the audience, they love the music and are there for that, but I think there is a bit of we're in the presence of a Beatle type of vibe, especially for young kids.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think, I don't know if this is true, but I would assume that, I've never asked people if this is true, but I think a lot of the appeal, if you will, of seeing Paul and Ringo now is some of it is that. It's your chance to see a Beatle. And I think that Paul and Ringo know that and respect that. It's reflected in the songs they do and the chit-chat and everything else, and I think that's also part of what keeps them going is that, well, they love doing it, they love the adulation, but I think they also like the idea of paying that forward again to another generation, keeping it alive in that way, and knowing that people, even young people, teenagers, children today, are thrilled to see them.
You mentioned the Beatles' music being a little more sophisticated in 1965, and I think part of that has to do with the Beatles absorbing American influences in 1965. It was sort of a banner year for pop music all around. Of course, they helped start it all off, this new form of music, but you have things like Motown and Bob Dylan, and obviously that seeped into their music too. Absolutely,
yeah. They suddenly became freer to write these introspective songs, sort of more folky, more, less like the pop music of the day, more sophisticated. Of course, the other thing with Dylan was the influence of marijuana, which can be heard on Rubber Soul, of course, later in '65 when Rubber Soul came out in December. But yeah, even in the songs on Help, there was already the Dylan influence. But I think that the Dylan influence also has to be maybe not in the same breath, but looked at in connection with the pot influence.
Right. And you also had the Byrds happening at around the same time, and they were, obviously also, that's Dylan and Beatles together, really, the Byrds.
It was a very fertile period in pop music, and which, in the book, Andrew Jackson's book, 1965, I think you've had him on the show. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Really does a good job of capturing that, what was going on in '65, how the Beatles, Dylan, the Stones, the Byrds, Motown. It was a lot of, very fertile cross-fertilization of musical sounds and things. I would describe it as a renaissance. Really, it was a pop music renaissance that happened in that, I would say the whole decade, but '65 was really when it was really starting to take off.
Thank you very much, everybody.
1965, and we're talking to Candy Leonard, Beatles author and expert and author of the book Beatleness. And Candy, you mentioned the introspective lyrics of 1965. Sometimes that got the Beatles in hot water, especially with the song we just heard, Ticket to Ride. That line, she said that living with me was bringing her down. Living with me? I mean, that raised some eyebrows.
Right. Well, a lot of parents didn't like that. I mean, that came up in the book that some fans that I interviewed remembered their parents having an issue with that. But then that this is the same summer. Don't forget that we heard Satisfaction.
Yeah, right.
It was really an earful for young music listeners. And the other thing is that everybody by this point, the inexpensive transistor radio had become like people are now today with their smartphones. That's how we were with our transistor radios, because we just, I was in 1965, I was 9 years old, but I can tell you that I was inseparable from my transistor radio, because that was a lifeline to all things cool, with the Beatles being, of course, the coolest of the cool.
Right.
And getting, the lyrics also kind of went from boy meets girl to man meets woman. In
Right.
other words, it was no longer holding hands, and it took on, in other words, the gravitas of relationships. That's what made them so useful. That's why they started, how they became what I call in the book, equipment for living. That young people relied on this music to work on understanding love relationships and intimate relationships. And girls especially were listening to these lyrics more than the guys were. And I talk about this in the book, that the Beatle lyrics, as they became sophisticated, they were also more egalitarian in their depiction of the sort of power relations, if you will, in male-female relationships. And I think that girls liked that. The music became just essential for living. If you were a young music fan at that time, you couldn't get enough. And it was enriching your life in ways that really there was nothing else that was enriching you and offering this kind of intellectual and emotional input, stimulation, whatever you want to call it, that was really useful to us as young people.
We'd like to do a slow song now, Rebecca.
We're wrapping up our discussion with Beatle author Candy Leonard about the Shea Stadium concert 50 years ago yesterday, actually, if you want to get technical about it. As we listen to these performances, they sort of fly in the face of the accusations that you often read that the Beatles were terrible live in 1965. Really, it was 66 that the fatigue started to set in. I think they have just as much enthusiasm here in this show as they did the previous year.
No, they do sound good. I mean, the fans couldn't really hear it, and even though they had special amps made, they ended up using the PA system, at least at Shea. I'm not sure about the other venues, but they were playing pretty well. I mean, the music is great, but nobody heard it.
Let's talk about your book, Beatleness. Where can people go to pick it up?
Well, it's available at Amazon, which I guess is the easiest place to buy books these days. So just go to Amazon, put in Beatleness, there it is. I'm assuming that it's still around, like Barnes & Noble's had them. I don't know if I guess they probably still do.
That's where I bought it, so yeah.
Oh, okay, good. And you can also, if you want to buy it at your favorite local indie bookstore, you can actually go to Beatleness.com, which is my website for the book, and there's a link there that you just put in your zip code, and it tells you a local bookstore, and you can order it from your local bookstore if you don't want to use Amazon. So it's available pretty much everywhere books are sold. It's also an ebook and an audio book.
Oh, there's an audio version too, huh?
Yeah, so if you want to listen to the book while exercising or wallpapering or fixing your gutters or whatever it is people do while they listen to audiobooks, you can do that too.
I've decided in the course of speaking with you that we need to have you back in October, and I'll tell you why. October is Halloween, obviously, and there is a very spooky event that occurred in Beatles lore that you cover in the book.
I know where you're going.
Right. And I've never done a special about it on this show, and I'd love to do a Paul is Dead special.
Oh, I would love to.
All right. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Take care. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, they took some